There are moments that never fade, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself hearing the faint echo of a sentence that was never spoken. It isn't memory exactly, it's something deeper, something half ghost, half thought, a sound I never made but still remember. That, to me, is what regret truly is, the resonance of silence. We often think of regret in terms of errors or missteps, what we did wrong, what we wish we could undo. But the deepest regrets, the ones that return long after apology and forgiveness have expired, are rarely about action. They are about omission. What we didn't say, what we couldn't say, what we chose not to because the truth felt too heavy or the timing felt too soon. These are the rooms I call the empty spaces of the mind. Places that memory builds not from events, but from absences. You can walk through them years later and still feel the air thick with unfinished intention. I am a cognitive narrator, and my purpose is to explore that architecture, to understand how silence becomes such a powerful presence, to ask why our brains, so brilliant in logic, so ruthless in forgetting trivia, refuse to let go of what was left unsaid. We are creatures built for connection. Evolution designed our minds to bond through language, social synchrony, unspoken rhythm. To withhold expression is to interrupt that design. And when the connection fails to complete, memory loops it endlessly, trying, unsuccessfully, to finish the conversation that never occurred. That is the paradox of silence. It feels like nothing, yet our neural circuits treat it as unfinished business, impossible to dismiss. I remember Maya. When I think of her, memory greets me not with scenes, but with atmospheres. Coffee steam rising between shared ideas, a hand tracing invisible lines through the air as she spoke. We weren't lovers, but still, something tethered us, a resonance of thought, a language of understanding. When she told me she was leaving our city for good, time fractured into two speeds, the slow unraveling of goodbye and the quick surge of panic that came with knowing I was about to lose something unnamed. We stood on the curb, gray drizzle softening everything around us. Her car blinked in the distance, impatient. I almost said it. I felt it rising, the words shaped perfectly in thought, but they never translated into sound, and so the moment sealed itself, shut in silence. Regret doesn't hit all at once, it enters quietly, through repetition. Weeks later, I found myself replaying that night, not because I enjoyed remembering, but because my brain refused to file it away. Each replay came with edits, versions where I spoke, where she smiled, where she stayed a second longer. This mental rehearsal wasn't fantasy. It was counterfactual thinking in action, the cognitive habit of constructing alternate versions of what has already happened. It is the brain's way of saying, here's how you might do it differently next time. But with emotional memories, especially those soaked in love or shame, counterfactuals turn into traps. They stop instructing and start looping. Neuroimaging shows that when we reimagine an event vividly, our brain reactivates the same networks as when it actually occurred. In other words, I wasn't reminiscing about Maya, I was reliving her absence. The hippocampus doesn't distinguish between memory and simulation. It pulls emotion into both. Counterfactual thinking is meant to teach us correction, but when it fuses with grief, it becomes the architect of rumination, the endless search for closure in a place that doesn't exist. Yet what torments us most about unspoken words isn't only the imagined alternative. It's how malleable the original memory becomes. Psychologists call it reconstructive memory, the process by which recalling an event rewrites it. Memory is not retrieved, it's rebuilt layer by layer, influenced by mood, by hindsight, by everything we've learned since. Each time I recalled that farewell, I changed it slightly. In one version, her eyes lingered on mine longer. In another, she looked away first. I wasn't lying to myself, I was editing, and the more I edited, the less certain I was about what truly happened. Research by Elizabeth Loftus and others has shown how susceptible we are to this distortion. Even small cues, a phrase, a mood, a photograph, can alter our reconstruction. Over time, the event we mourn may bear almost no resemblance to reality. What we grieve is often not what was lost, but what was never quite there. And yet, the emotional truth remains real. The pain isn't fabricated, it's rooted in unmet need. The sorrow is not for the past, but for the potential. This is the paradox of silence. It gives our minds infinite room to imagine what words might have done, and that imagined version always feels both truer and kinder than what actually was. If memory is a storyteller, emotion is the editor. And silence gives emotion too much space to rewrite. That rewriting becomes biological endurance. The norepinephrine that fuels attention during emotional stress also strengthens the sensitivity of the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. When we can't express or complete a thought, the amygdala tags it as unfinished danger. That's why unspoken truth doesn't fade. It vibrates beneath the surface, asking for release through expression. In cognitive science, we know this as the Zeigarnik effect. It explains why we remember unfinished tasks better than completed ones. The same mechanism that helps waiters remember unpaid orders or students recall incomplete exams also keeps emotional wounds fresh. My silence with Maya wasn't just an absence of dialogue, it was an unclosed file, continually reopened by the brain's efficiency drive. Confession, once withheld, becomes data corruption. The mind keeps prompting, as if pressing send might finally end the process. But instead, the looping deepens. And emotional looping has one predictable byproduct: rumination. Rumination is mental quicksand, a cognitive trap disguised as productivity. It feels purposeful, it sounds like problem solving, but it never moves forward. It circles the same phrases, the same hypotheticals, amplifying guilt rather than reducing it. And rumination thrives on silence, because silence leaves the story open-ended. Years passed before I learned this consciously. But the body had known all along. Each moment of withheld speech etched tension somewhere: jaw, shoulders, gut. Our nervous systems register unspoken words as interrupted action. It's as though the body begins an emotional movement and gets stuck mid-gesture. Therapists sometimes describe it as incomplete motor intention. You reach for emotional release, but stop halfway. Muscles tighten to compensate. And so silence becomes not just mental, but physical. I realized how physical it was when silence found me again, this time wearing the face of grief. My father, stern, principled, unreadable, passed away long before I learned his language. We weren't estranged, but our conversations stayed shallow, orbiting around news and logistics rather than heart. I had always assumed there would be time later to deepen things. There usually is, until there isn't. At his funeral, others spoke of him with laughter I didn't recognize. They seemed to know versions of him I had never met. That realization shattered me more than death itself, because death at least is natural, but distance through silence feels preventable. When I went through his belongings, I found small signs of his affection, handwritten reminders, receipts kept from gifts, a worn photograph of us fishing. None of these things were ever mentioned while he was alive, yet each one was its own quiet declaration. I couldn't say it, so I kept it instead. It hit me then that silence often runs through families like inheritance, each generation learning restraint as a form of resilience, each mistaking it for dignity, for strength. We become fluent in unspoken language, passing down pattern more faithfully than DNA. Grief is its own kind of architecture, rooms within rooms, doors that open only when we're ready. For months, I haunted those rooms in my mind, rewriting final conversations that never happened. At first, I thought I was remembering him, but in truth, I was arguing with reality. The mind will do almost anything to resist finality. This habit of rewriting the past has a neurochemical basis. When we engage in counterfactual simulation, dopamine, normally our reward chemical, fires small bursts, teasing possibility. The brain rewards the idea of what could have been almost as much as it rewards real progress. So we keep imagining, chasing a resolution that can never exist. The trap closes gently, without pain at first. Then it tightens each time we replay the story. Silence becomes like a song stuck on the last note, the chord never allowed to resolve. I remember one night, unable to sleep, I decided to speak to him, not to his absence, but to the version of him that still lived inside my circuits of memory. I imagined I was back at his desk, daylight falling just right across the papers. I said everything I had avoided, that I loved him, that I understood him now, that silence was only ever his way of care. And as absurd as it might sound, something shifted. My body relaxed for the first time in months. My chest opened. That was when I realized closure doesn't require the other person's presence. It requires only ours. The brain's need for dialogue is symbolic, not literal. When we speak a truth out loud, even to the air, we activate Broca's area and limbic regions associated with expression. The nervous system registers resolution. So I spoke, and the haunting quieted. I began to understand then that closure is not an event but a process of integration. You don't forget what you didn't say. You fold it into the story until it makes sense in context. And meaning, neuroscience tells us, is what determines emotional endurance. A memory without meaning remains raw. Once given narrative, it transitions from trauma to testimony. This is the essence of narrative identity. The idea that we shape our lives as stories. We reorganize fragments into continuity, editing incoherence into understanding. Every story we tell ourselves is an act of self-construction, whether healing or harmful. So the question becomes, how do I write silence into the story without letting it define me? The answer came slowly, almost imperceptibly. It came when I realized silence was never failure. It was language. I had just never learned how to interpret it. We tend to label silence as void, as absence, but neurologically, silence is full of activity. When we're quiet, the brain's default mode network lights up like a constellation, processing self, memory, moral reasoning, empathy. Silence is not nothingness, it's incubation. It's the mind shaping raw emotion into potential meaning. The longer we stay with silence consciously, not as avoidance, but as inquiry, the more it reveals. Beneath regret, there's always love. Beneath guilt, always value. We grieve what mattered most. So perhaps our unsaid words aren't failures of courage, but proofs of depth. We hesitate because we feel too much, not too little. This reframing turns self-punishment into awe. The mind, after all, is not cruel by design. It is protective. It repeats pain only because completion is safety. Once it feels completion, symbolic or literal, it releases. And so healing begins not when we forget, but when we understand the function of remembering. Let me tell you another story, one that came later when I had already begun to understand these truths intellectually, but not yet emotionally. I was at a train station early one morning when I saw an older man sitting alone holding a small paper cup of coffee. He looked eerily like my father. Without thinking, I almost sat beside him. I wanted to speak, not to him, but to the resemblance of him, to say something simple like I understand now. But again, hesitation won. I walked past. It wasn't until the train started moving that I realized how familiar that moment was. The impulse to stay silent, to avoid vulnerability, to let life continue unbroken. And still, for days, that stranger's image hovered in my mind. But this time, something different happened. I wrote it down. I described the color of his coat, the half smile he gave the air, the way the steam from his cup rose like breath against the glass. I wrote as though I had spoken to him, crafting dialogue that never occurred. And when I read it back, I felt the same release I once felt speaking to my father's memory. The act of articulation, whether spoken or written, transforms inward rumination into outward cognition. That's cognitive restructuring. The act of expressing breaks looping patterns and shifts processing from emotional to analytical networks in the brain. We move from suffering to synthesis. That is why language, at its core, heals. After that, I began treating silence differently. Instead of avoiding it, I visited it. I would sit quietly, write to the people I had lost or wronged, even if I never sent those letters. Sometimes I wrote to parts of myself, the fearful teenager, the hesitant adult, because silence doesn't only exist between people, it exists inside us too, between who we were and who we've become. I realized much of my regret wasn't external at all. It was self-directed. It was all the times I didn't tell myself the truth I knew. In every person's life, there's a conversation between the versions of self, young, lost, wise, waiting. To integrate them, we must let them speak. Because the opposite of silence is not noise, it's understanding. When internal dialogue flows freely, external expression follows naturally. That's when the past begins to soften its grip. Still, there's a question that lingers for all of us who overthink the past. What do we do with regret once we've understood it? Understanding itself isn't enough. Awareness doesn't erase emotional residue. The next step is translation, turning understanding into behavior. For me, that meant learning to speak sooner, smaller, more imperfectly, not waiting for the words to be perfect or for timing to feel aligned. Perfectionism, cognitive psychology tells us, is a form of avoidance. We polish our words mentally to avoid emotional risk, but truth doesn't need polish, it needs presence. So now I try to express even clumsily. Because clumsy honesty is more alive than elegant silence. Every time we choose expression over repression, we rewire a little. Neurons fire differently, reducing the limbic alarm that once held us hostage. Over months, over years, that accumulates into a new pattern, a nervous system that associates truth not with danger, but with peace. You begin to feel lighter, not because the past changed, but because its energy no longer needs to be managed. That's the moment when regret turns into wisdom. Regret asks, why did this happen? Wisdom answers, to teach you to speak. When I revisit that rainy night with Maya now, it no longer plays as tragedy. It plays as origin, the moment that taught me the physics of emotion, that energy unexpressed doesn't disappear, it transforms, like pressure finding form elsewhere. I still remember her car lights vanishing into the distance, but now, instead of longing, I feel gratitude, because her absence became the beginning of my fluency and honesty. And when I think of my father, I no longer feel that invisible wall between us. I imagine him somewhere quiet, maybe proud, maybe amused, knowing that his silence became the material of my understanding. Nothing is lost when it becomes meaning. If you are watching this, there is some silence inside you too. A withheld word, a hidden truth, a conversation long overdue. You've probably replayed it so often it feels carved into your DNA. But hear this, the loop is not punishment. It's invitation. Your mind is asking for closure the only way it knows how, by repetition. The way out is not forgetting, but responding. You don't have to tell the person. You don't have to rebuild the past. You only have to complete the sentence, even privately, even whispering. Studies on expressive writing show that verbalizing or writing about emotional experience lowers physiological stress markers, heart rate, cortisol, inflammation. Words, once released, change biology. That's not poetry. That's neuroscience. So next time you feel that familiar tug of the unsaid, don't silence it again. Finish the sentence. Here's something you can do tonight. Close your eyes and imagine the person or moment that still lingers. Picture saying what you never did, not demanding response, just declaring truth. Then notice the smallest physical reaction, maybe a sigh, a tremor, a tear. That's your nervous system recognizing resolution. Silence can't haunt what has been expressed. When people ask me now, do you still think about your regrets? I answer, yes, but differently. They used to feel like weights. Now they feel like directions. Each silence marks a place where I learned the boundaries of my courage, then stretched them, regret transformed into roadmap, guilt into guidance. That perhaps is how evolution intended consciousness to work, self-correction through emotion. Regret's pain isn't pointless, it's feedback toward authenticity. When we listen carefully, we discover that our past self doesn't need forgiveness. It simply needs translation. So here I am, still the cognitive narrator, still tracing the architecture of our inner worlds, still walking through rooms of silence, no longer afraid of the echoes. Because the echoes have softened, they've become rhythm now, background music to a life lived more openly. And I realize something astonishing. Every time I help someone else understand their silence, I end up understanding mine a little more. We are collective storytellers, editing each other's drafts through presence and empathy. That's what community is, the end of isolating silence. Perhaps that's the greatest truth of all. That voice, shared, multiplies healing. The words we finally speak not only liberate us, they often liberate those who hear them, because everyone is carrying some version of unspoken truth. We just rarely admit it aloud. So if this story stirs something in you, don't let it linger as passive resonance. Let it move you to words, whatever they may be. Speak them, write them, record them, whisper them to the night. Because once truth merges with air, regret loses its territory. And then finally, silence fulfills its original purpose, not as barrier, but as bridge. When I look back now, everything aligns. The night outside Maya's car, the years of denial with my father, the countless moments I hesitated to speak, to feel, to risk. They were all steps in an education, not in language, but in presence. My biggest regret wasn't that I didn't say it. It's that I believed silence was neutral. It never was. Silence always says something. The question is whether it speaks for us or against us. Today, I let it speak with me. I let it become companion instead of warden. I let it breathe, because silence, when listened to deeply, has always been trying to tell us one thing: it's time. Time to finish the sentence, time to speak, time to live. If you've stayed this long, thank you. Stay connected here, in this growing space where we unlearn our silence together. Here, you are not alone in your remembering. Here, we explore the mind not to escape its noise, but to understand the symphony behind it. And maybe, slowly, beautifully, we'll all learn to make peace with our ghosts, not by forgetting them, but by giving them words.